Your grandfather retired a millionaire. And in his world, that word meant something almost unimaginable. It meant he had won. It meant a big house, no worries, the kind of security the whole family talked about in hushed, slightly odd voices at holidays. Millionaire. The word itself sounded like a finish line, like the end of the movie where everything works out. And for him, it basically was, now picture someone today hitting that exact same number, $1 million. The same magic figure your grandfather retired on. They expect to feel what he felt, that wave of arrival, of being set for life. And instead, they sit down, run the actual math, and get a very strange, very uncomfortable feeling. Because $1 million today might fund a careful, modest, watch every dollar retirement. It might last, it might not. And it definitely does not feel like the mansion and champagne finish line the word has always promised. Same number, same word, two completely different lives, separated by nothing but the decades in which that word quietly lost its power. My name is Wealth Peak, and today we're going to talk about why $1 million, the most famous number in all of personal finance, the literal definition of made it, quietly stopped being enough to actually retire on for a lot of people. And I have to get one objection out of the way immediately, because it's already forming in half of your heads. Yes, I know, $1 million is still a lot of money. It's more than most people will ever see. And if you have it, you are doing better than the overwhelming majority of humans on Earth. I'm not going to pretend a millionaire is broke. That would be insulting. But here's the thing this video is actually about. Being a lot of money and being enough to retire on are two completely different questions. And we've spent our whole lives letting one famous number answer both. So stick with me, because the goal here isn't to depress you about $1 million. It's to free you from a finish line that was drawn a very long time ago and never updated. Let's start with why that number is so stuck in our heads in the first place, because that's the whole root of the problem. Millionaire is not really a financial term anymore. It's a cultural one. It's been the shorthand for rich in movies, songs, game shows, and daydreams for so long that the meaning got welded on permanently. When you were a kid and you imagined being wealthy, you didn't imagine a specific income or a diversified portfolio. You imagined having $1 million because that's the number the culture handed you as the definition of success. And that number got frozen culturally decades ago, back when it genuinely did mean a mansion and a yacht. The word kept its old meaning in our imagination long after the math underneath it had completely changed. We're all walking around chasing a finish line painted onto the road in a different era, and nobody repainted it. And this matters more than it seems, because the number we chase quietly shapes every financial decision we make. If your target is $1 million, you save toward $1 million, you feel successful at $1 million, you decide you're allowed to retire at $1 million. The number isn't just a daydream. It becomes the actual trigger for one of the biggest decisions of your life. So if the number is wrong, if it's a relic that doesn't mean what you think it means, then you might pull the trigger on retirement at exactly the wrong moment, feeling completely safe right up until reality arrives a few years later. That's the danger of a frozen finish line. It doesn't just disappoint you. It can convince you you've won the race when you're actually still running and get you to stop moving at precisely the point where you most need it to keep going. So let's talk about what actually happened to the number, because this is the first uncomfortable layer. The million itself decayed. Not the pile of cash sitting in the account that's still $1 million. What decayed is what those dollars can buy because of inflation, the slow, relentless rise in prices over decades. $1 million today has the buying power of something far smaller in your grandfather's time. To match what $1 million bought back when the word meant mansion, you'd need multiples of that today. So the person hitting $1 million now and expecting grandpa's life is, without realizing it, aiming at a target that quietly shrank to a fraction of its old self while keeping the same famous name. The number didn't change. The world around it did, and dragged the meaning right out of it. And here's what makes inflation so sneaky. In this specific case, it doesn't announce itself. Nobody ever ran a headline saying the word millionaire has been officially downgraded. There was no ceremony, no update to the daydream. The number just sat there in our culture, unchanged, sounding exactly as rich as it always did, while behind the scenes prices doubled and doubled again over the decades. So an entire generation grew up aiming at a word whose real value was silently eroding the whole time they chased it. It's like running toward a finish line that's slowly being dragged backward, except you can't see it moving because the sign on it still says the same thing. You arrive, exhausted and proud, at the exact spot you aimed for, and discover the prize behind the sign is a fraction of what the sign advertised. But inflation is the obvious part. Here's the layer that actually shocks people, the one that makes them go quiet. What does $1 million actually produce as income once you retire? Here's the reality nobody prepares you for. When you retire on a pile of money, you can't just spend the whole pile, or it runs out and you're destitute at 80. You have to live off what it safely generates each year without draining it too fast. And by the rough guidelines most planners use, $1 million safely produces somewhere around $40,000 a year of income. Let that sit for a second. The most famous wealth number in the world, the definition of rich, throws off an annual income roughly in line with a very ordinary job. Not a mansion, not a yacht, a modest middle-of-the-road income generated by a pile of money so big it took most people an entire lifetime to build. That's the disconnect that stuns people when they finally do the math. The pile looks enormous. The income it produces looks average. And you're supposed to live on the income, not the pile. Break that 40,000 down to a monthly number and it lands even harder. That's a little over $3,000 a month to cover everything. Housing, food, utilities, insurance, healthcare, transportation, and whatever you'd actually like to do with your newfound free time. $3,000 a month is a perfectly normal budget for a working person. But here's the thing. You built $1 million precisely so. Retirement would feel like more than normal, like a reward. And instead, the sacred number hands you a paycheck that looks a lot like the one you were already living on, except now there's no raise coming ever again. That's the emotional whiplash. People spend 40 years imagining that crossing the $1 million line feels like winning. And then they cross it, and it feels like they simply swapped a salary for a slightly smaller, permanent, fixed one. The pile is a mountain. The stream coming off it is a creek. And here's where it gets personal. Because that $40,000 a year isn't measured in a vacuum. It's measured against the life you actually built. And this is the layer that catches successful people completely off guard. The kind of person who manages to save $1 million is usually not the kind of person living a bare bones life. They've got the nicer house in the nicer area with the property taxes and the upkeep that come with it. They've got the habits, the travel, the standards that a good income built over decades. So when they retire, they're not trying to fund a minimal existence on that $40,000. They're trying to fund the life they're used to. And that life inflated right alongside their income the whole time they were building the million. So the million gets measured against a lifestyle that grew to meet it. And suddenly the gap opens up. The very success that let you save $1 million also raised the cost of the life you now want to keep living. The number and the lifestyle grew up together, and the number lost. There's a cruel little irony tucked inside this. The person who was frugal enough to actually reach $1 million is often, by that very fact, someone whose income was high, which means their whole life was scaled to a high income, which means their retirement costs are high too. Meanwhile, imagine someone who never made much and lived modestly their entire life. They might retire on far less than $1 million and feel completely fine because their life was never expensive to run in the first place. So you get this strange inversion where the big, impressive number can feel tighter than the small, humble one, purely because of the lifestyle each one is attached to. The million isn't measured against some universal standard of enough. It's measured against the specific, personal, often expensive life the millionaire spent decades building around themselves. And a life built to match a strong income doesn't suddenly get cheaper the day the income stops. And look, if this is landing a little too precisely, if you're quietly measuring your own number against your own life right now, that exact feeling is why I built a school community. It's where I break down how I take this kind of research and turn it into a faceless YouTube channel that actually grows. The digging, the scripting, the whole system, step by step. No gatekeeping, no upsell. If you've ever thought about building something of your own out of this exact kind of curiosity, the links are in the description. Come hang out. Now here's the layer that flips the whole thing on its head, because everything I've said so far makes it sound like $1 million is never enough. And that's not true either. Two more variables decide everything, and they're wildly personal. How long you live and where you live. Start with longevity. $1 million that has to last 15 years is a completely different animal than $1 million that has to last 35. If you retire early and live a long life, you're asking that same pile to stretch across decades of rising costs, and it thins out fast. If you retire later and don't live as long, that $1 million can be downright comfortable. So the exact same number is either plenty or nowhere near enough. And the deciding factor is something none of us actually knows in advance, our own lifespan. You're trying to size a pile of money against a finish line you can't see. It's like packing supplies for a journey when nobody will tell you if it's a 2-week trip or a 2-year expedition. Pack for 2 weeks and get 2 years, you starve. And the maddening part is you only find out which trip you were on when you're already deep into it. And then geography, which might be the biggest variable of all, and the one people ignore completely. $1 million in an expensive coastal city where a modest house costs a fortune and everything is priced for high earners might genuinely be a tight, careful retirement. That same $1 million in a low-cost town or a cheaper country could fund a genuinely comfortable, even luxurious life. Same pile, same person. The difference between struggling and thriving comes down entirely to the zip code you unpack it in. So when someone asks, is $1 million enough? The honest answer is another question. Enough where and for how long? The number by itself means almost nothing until you attach it to a life, a lifespan, and a location. And this geography lever is quietly one of the most powerful tools a retiree actually has, precisely because it's the one thing on this whole list you can genuinely control. You can't control inflation. You can't control how long you'll live. You can't control what the market does in your first few years. But you can, within reason, control where you plant yourself. The exact same $1 million that buys a nervous, penny-counting retirement in one place can buy a relaxed, generous one an hour's drive or a state line away. People will chase an extra % of investment return for years while completely ignoring the fact that moving to a cheaper area could effectively add decades of runway to the identical pile of money. It's the biggest lever hiding in plain sight, and most people never even consider pulling it because they assume where they live is fixed. It usually isn't. It's a choice, and it might be the most financially consequential retirement choice of all. So let me be completely fair and steelman the other side, because I refuse to leave you thinking $1 million is worthless. It absolutely is not. For a huge number of people, $1 million is genuinely enough to retire well. And here's honestly who. If you own your home outright, so you have no rent or mortgage eating your income, $1 million stretches dramatically further. If you have Social Security or a pension coming in on top of that $1 million, and most people have at least the former, then the $1 million isn't carrying the whole load by itself. It's a supplement, and that changes everything. If you live somewhere affordable, keep a reasonable lifestyle, and retire at a normal age rather than trying to fund 40 years of it, $1 million can be plenty, comfortable even. And $1 million invested sensibly, combined with a paid-off house and Social Security, puts you in a position most of the world would trade places with in a heartbeat. So the point was never that $1 million is nothing. The point is that $1 million is not automatically enough the way the word millionaire tricks us into assuming. It's a number that has to be checked against your actual life, not a magic password that unlocks retirement on its own. So let me compress this whole thing into 3 beats in case you drifted off somewhere around the 40,000. Millionaire is a cultural finish line, frozen in a past where it meant far more than it does now. $1 million produces a surprisingly ordinary income, measured against a lifestyle that grew right alongside it. And whether it's plenty or poverty depends entirely on how long you live and where you live. Frozen finish line, ordinary income, bigger life. Enough depends on when and where. So how do you find your real number? The one that actually applies to you instead of the one a movie handed you? Because that's the whole point, and it's more freeing than it sounds. The real question was never, how do I hit 1 million? It's how much annual income do I actually need to fund the specific life I want, in the specific place I want to live it, for however long I might live. Start from the life, not the number. Figure out what your year actually costs, subtract what Social Security or a pension will cover, and only then work backward to the pile of money that safely generates the rest. For some people, that pile is well under 1 million. For others, especially in expensive places with long lifespans, it's well over. But it's yours, calculated from your reality instead of borrowed from a daydream. And here's the quietly liberating part. Once you do that, the million stops being a source of anxiety and becomes just a data point. Maybe your real number is 700,000 and you're closer than you thought. Maybe it's 1.5 million and you'd rather know that now than find out at 70. Either way, you've traded a vague cultural pressure for a real personal target you can actually aim at. That's not depressing. That's the first honest map anyone's handed you. So think about your grandfather and today's millionaire one last time. Your grandfather wasn't smarter, and today's million holder isn't a failure. The number didn't betray anyone. It's just that a symbol got mistaken for a plan. Your grandfather happened to hit that number in a decade when it meant what the word said. Today's retiree hit the same number in a world where the word and the math had quietly divorced, and nobody sent the announcement. The word millionaire kept glowing with all its old wattage in everyone's imagination, long after the bulb behind it had dimmed. Because that's the real lesson, and it was never about $1 million specifically. It's that no single number, however famous, however sacred, can tell you whether you can retire. Because retirement was never a number. It's a relationship between what you have, how you live, how long you last, and where you stand. The million was always a symbol, and symbols don't pay grocery bills. Real numbers do, and your real number has your name on it, not the culture's. So here's a question I'll leave you sitting with. That number you've been quietly aiming at your whole life, whatever it is, are you chasing it because you actually sat down and worked out that it's right for your life? Or because a movie you watched a long time ago told you it was the finish line, and you never once stopped to ask if it still was? Sit with that one. And if you want to figure it out next to other people doing the same thing, you already know where I'll be. I'll see you in the next one.